Hi there, I'm James Ryerson, and this is Line Edit, a video series about popular scholarly writing, generously supported by the John Templeton Foundation. Who am I? I'm a newspaper and magazine editor. I've been in the industry for more than 20 years at a variety of publications. For the past 18 years, I've been at the New York Times, first at the Sunday magazine, and now at the opinion pages. On each episode of Line Edit, I'll talk about my experience editing a specific piece by an academic I've worked with. These are short pieces, written for wide audiences, about the big questions. Today we're going to talk about an opinion piece written in the New York Times by Priyamvada Natarajan, an astrophysicist at Yale University. The piece was published in April of 2019, and the title of the op-ed is "At Long Last, A Glimpse of a Black Hole." The subtitle of the piece reads, "This week, scientists are expected to release images of the silhouette of this elusive and inscrutable astronomical object." For the full story on how this op-ed came to be and all the various considerations that went into running it, as well as the history of Priya's really interesting dual career as both a scientist and a public science writer, listen to our podcast Line Edit interview with Priya. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 edits, each one at a kind of different order of magnitude. One is a kind of big picture edit that has to do with the kind of overall structure and framing of the piece. The other is a kind of mid-tier, mid-sized edit, which has to do with a slightly more substantive point about the argument itself and what should go in the argument, what should not go in the argument. And the third is a really small edit, really at the size of a word or two, the kind of edit that doesn't take a lot of time to do, but can have an outsized impact in the piece itself. So Priya wrote this piece in response to a scientific development, the first images that scientists had ever acquired of a black hole. To some extent, this is a straightforward science news story, and part of what Priya wanted to argue was that this was an important finding, which is very similar to what the news stories were also reporting. That had some value, though, in an opinion piece because she was explaining it in her own way with a little bit more of her own perspective. But what made it really an opinion piece is she wanted to talk not just about what sort of scientific accomplishment this was, but about the larger significance of getting an image like this, what it meant for our sense of ourselves and relation to the cosmos. That's the kind of argument she wanted to make. So that leads me to the first edit that I want to talk about today, the big picture edit. In Priya's first draft, she begins by going more than 400 years back in time to talk about Galileo's first watercolor images of the cosmos, then 200 years later, first astronomical photograph. And she talks a little bit about the significance of astronomical images to expand human vision and knowledge. Now, these are all, as I hinted at earlier, really useful historical points to make when it comes to her overall point that something about the actual photograph and image of a black hole is significant beyond just the scientific accomplishment, that it fits into kind of a story of the role that images have played in scientific discovery and our sense of our ability to understand and appreciate astronomical discovery. So this information is all good and useful. The problem I identified as an editor with this particular approach is that it's a little hard for the reader to know where she's going with this. She goes way back in time. We're hearing about Galileo and his watercolors. We're hearing about Daguerre and his photographs. And we're exploring some of those ideas, and we don't really have a context for them. And more importantly, this is a major news story. That very week on Wednesday, they were expecting to see these images of the black hole. What I propose doing is starting this piece with the news. On Wednesday or this week, we may get the first glimpse of what scientists have long been able to only theorize about, the edge of a black hole. And the main reason to start here is, for one thing, at this point in time, the news story hadn't even broke. So simply to begin with the fact that we may get the first glimpse ever of a black hole, that was arresting, it was interesting, and it's the beginning of the story. So the general point here is captured in a very common journalistic phrase, don't bury the lead. And by lead, really the beginning of the story. Don't bury the beginning of the story. If you can jump right into a story when it begins, do that. Now, there are many occasions when it is okay, and in fact advisable, to begin an op-ed like this, a short piece, by going back in time and telling the history. My own rule of thumb for how to tell whether it's advisable and in fact necessary is if you really can't imagine making the point in any other way. There are plenty of pieces I edit where I myself think, wow, I can't really explain this without foregrounding the historical information, without taking us back in time. So if you really feel like you can't figure out a way to tell it without going back in time, trust your instincts, go back in time. But if there's any way just to dive right into the present, to begin the story where the action is, not to bury the lead, that's generally the best way to go. And so this brings me to my second point, my second edit, the more kind of mid-sized edit. You'll see that the history now at the end really drives home Priya's point. She's made her general point about the importance of the discovery. She's made her general point about the power of images. And then she's reminded us that it's ever been thus, that the history of science has always worked in astronomy through images like this. Now, in her original draft, when she was searching for an ending, she, in her final sentence, does make that point that the images have a potential to redefine our place in the cosmos. So she does make that point. However, in her original draft, she adds that the images have the potential to redefine our place in the cosmos and also how we steward the planet and also how we direct our impulse to explore and become an interplanetary species. So right there at the very end of the piece, in not even the last full sentence, but in the last half of the last sentence, she introduces two new notions, not just that the images have some sort of potential to redefine our place in the cosmos, but that they might, for one thing, change the way we think about Earth and our responsibility to Earth. And for another thing, that they might change the way we think about our place in the universe vis-a-vis other planets and other life forms, perhaps intelligent life forms that live in other planets. So there's a lot of ideas, really rich ideas, all of which really could have been other pieces that she wrote about the significance of this finding. She could have done a whole piece about the significance of this image and how it affects our relationship to Earth and our sense of responsibility for it. She could have done a piece about these images and how they generate in us a sense of wonder about whether we're alone in the cosmos. All these things, these are not bad ideas that she introduced, but it's just a lot of ideas. They go by very quickly. They're introduced in a very compressed form, and they just explode out of nowhere right at the end of the piece. So I think this is a general lesson. There is often an urge when you're writing, particularly if you're an academic, to quickly give a sense of the full scope of all the possible implications of what you've just argued. But in this case, you don't want to open anything new at the close of your piece. At the close of your piece, you really want to be closing things off, not opening, widening, introducing new ideas. So for the third edit on this piece, I want to focus, as I said, on something pretty small. In fact, it's a really quick edit. I don't think it took me more than 15 seconds to make. And I think it's the kind of edit that your editor will make for you if you don't do it yourself. But I think it's worth pointing out because it speaks to a general attitude towards jargon and specialized language in pieces by academics. About midway through the piece, Priya is referring to well-known supermassive black holes. In the final version of the piece, we refer to the first black hole. We mentioned that it's 26,000 light years away, and we refer to the second, which is Behemoth at the center of one of the largest nearby galaxies. That is to say, we refer to the first black hole and the second black hole. We do not refer to Sagittarius A star or M87. Now, you might think, why lose a fun little detail like that? There's a little color, a little extra information. What does the piece gain by removing information? My own view, and I think the view of a lot of other people who do this kind of editing, is that this kind of specialized jargon and naming, it's useful to leave into a piece like this if it adds something really substantive beyond just a name, or if it helps people stay connected to an object in the piece that's going to be mentioned later. If she was going to talk about Sagittarius A prime several times throughout the piece, referring to it as the first black hole or the black hole that's 26,000 light years away wouldn't be particularly useful in a case like that. Being able to name it and refer to it on subsequent references is very useful. But when you're just mentioning it once, I find that kind of information can be a little distracting. First of all, I don't know what Sagittarius A prime or A star is. I don't even know how to pronounce it. I don't know if I'm supposed to know that it signifies something particularly interesting and that all of a sudden left out of the conversation. M87, is there something I'm supposed to understand about that? These kind of questions, I think, are invited more than they are answered in a piece like this. And the general lesson that I would apply here is take information out to keep people in. It's only going to be alienating to all of a sudden have the piece feel like it's being written to other astrophysicists and not to general lay readers with an interest in science. Thanks again for joining us for Line Edit. We're very grateful to the public engagement team at the John Templeton Foundation, who made this project and its associated podcasts possible. Many thanks as well to Professors Dave DeSteno and Lisa Feldman-Barrett at Northeastern University, which administers our grant. And of course, we couldn't have done this without the generosity of Priya Natarajan, who graciously allowed us to look under the microscope at her first draft as well as the final product. This video was hosted and produced by me, James Ryerson, and produced and edited by Joseph Friedman. Happy writing.